What can I say, Muse? I took a week off. It's not like I needed a break from you. And I had plenty to say. Well, it just didn't happen. And you're just going to have to forgive me because everything is a little bit wacky right now. You know, because of, well, you know. Anyway, I'm finally going to talk about something that actually has to do with the craft of writing. And I don't mean indirectly, I mean directly. Now, I'm going to warn you, Muse, that this is a bit esoteric. And some people listening to this conversation may go, what the hell is he talking about? And how in the world am I supposed to apply that to writing? And some people will go, aha, I get it. And this is really for those who get it. Because I believe, and again, I'm still in the frame of prefacing, I believe the task of a writer, especially a writer of fiction, is to use any possible tool at their disposal to make their craft better, or to make the end result of their craft better, to improve their craft. Something in my eye and I need to improve it by getting it out. Now, I'm going to confess that for a brief time in undergraduate school, I was not only a theater and communications major, I was a music minor. Now, it's strange because I played tuba. Yeah, that's right. I played tuba. And, trying to make a music major out of the instrument tuba is not an easy thing. And truth be told, it wasn't until I got into music theory and had to play the circle of fifths that I realized that maybe I'm not cut out for this. And now it had to do with the teacher that I had at the time, because the teacher refused to let us do things the way we needed to do them, and I wasn't a piano player. So playing the circle of fifths on a piano was just not my cup of tea. Anyway, I did learn some really cool things in music theory. One particular thing that I learned in music theory stuck with me. I'm not going to talk about it in terms of music theory because it's pretty complicated when you get into the nuts and bolts of it. But eventually what happened was I started applying this music theory bit into my acting. And it was kind of subconscious at first, and then eventually I started thinking, what am I doing? And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm applying that music theory thing I learned into my acting. And then when I became a writer, eventually, after I got over the learning curve of being a writer, and I became comfortable with my voice and my process, I started thinking one day, is it possible for me to apply that thing that I learned in music theory and applied it to my acting? Can I apply it to my writing? And I realized that yes, indeed, I can. Now, what is this thing that I've been talking about, that I've been hinting that I'm going to talk about for weeks? That thing is called non-harmonic tones. Now, you can Google it to get the real gist of what it is. But essentially, a non-harmonic tone is a tone that is outside of the current chord that either creates dissonance or helps a chord transition to another chord. And a lot of times you will hear, there are millions of examples out there, but a lot of times you will hear in a piece of music, and you have to listen pretty carefully. Sometimes it's very obvious. You'll hear a chord, and there's a note in that chord, right? And that note in that chord might sound a bit dissonant. right? And then as that chord transitions to the next chord, that dissonant note resolves into the next chord to create harmony. Or it could be the opposite. A note in the current chord, the chord migrates to the next chord, and there's a note in there that remains the same and creates dissonance. There's like passing tones and neighboring tones, and I think there are 7, there might be more than, I think there are 7 non-harmonic tones, but I can't remember exactly. I'm really stretching the bounds of my memory, but I remembered that, and it, like I said, it stuck with me. And I'm going to tell you how I apply that to my writing. And what it does in my writing, and it adds another layer that wouldn't be there otherwise. Okay? And we all know that the more layers you add to your writing, the more dimensional it becomes. Of course, you can add way too many layers, and then it just becomes too complicated and a big old muddy mess, and we don't want that. So we have to be careful with how many layers we add. And this one you don't layer all the time. You don't use non-harmonic tones in writing all the time. When you do use them, when you finally figure out how to use them. I'm going to show you. I'm going to not show you. I'm going to tell you how. Let's say, for example, you have a scene between 2 characters, or 3, it doesn't matter. But you have a scene and, I don't know, there's an argument. There's something tense going on in this scene. And you know that you need, by the end of this scene, you need to resolve whatever is going on between these characters. Whatever it is, who really cares at this point? You can use your imagination because you're a writer, right? You've got a huge imagination. Your imagination encompasses everything. So, by the end of the scene, the tension has to resolve. Right? Like a chord, a dissonant chord transitioning to a non-dissonant chord. However, in the resolution of that scene, or that chord, you drop a little hint of something that isn't resolved, or a hint of something that could lead to the irresolution, the deresolution of that scene. Right? And we're not talking cliffhangers here, because whatever it is that that little nugget that you add to the resolution of that scene that makes the reader go, it's just like you're watching a scene on television. Yeah. And you have 2 lovers. They're in a fight. Right? And they're fighting and they're fighting and they're fighting and they're fighting. The scene goes on, and eventually the fighting gets a little less and a little less and a little less. And then by the end of the scene, they've made up and they're kissing or having makeup sex, whatever they're doing. But towards the end of the scene, the camera pans to the face of one of those lovers. And you see in the glinting of their eye some unresolved thing. And you think, as a watcher, viewer, you think, that fight's not over. And it's very subtle. But it adds a little bit of tension where one would think that tension has been resolved. That's how I use non-harmonic tones in writing. And it doesn't always have to be about tension, right? It could be humor. It's just taking a resolution of whatever that is, or you can even just think of it as the end of a scene, right? And adding something to the end of that scene, even if it's not the end of it, it doesn't have to be the end of a chapter. It could just be the end of 2 people talking. And you add something to the end of that scene that makes the reader lean in and go, what? something's going to happen later. It's kind of a way to lead the reader on. And I don't mean that in the negative way. I mean that in a way of getting the reader to go to want to keep reading, because that is ultimately the goal, is to make readers want to keep reading. And sometimes we do that with trickery. Sometimes we do that with just a damn good story, damn good dialogue. And sometimes we just add the slightest bit of trickery to the end of that scene to go, but wait, there's more. And that's kind of how I apply non-harmonic tones to my writing. And I do it as often as I can without abusing it, because you don't want the resolution of every scene between people or between storylines or whatever. You don't want every one of those to have this nugget of, this isn't over yet. Because sometimes it really needs to be over. Because if you keep not resolving to 100% every scene, your readers are just going to get exhausted. And you don't want to do that. Every so often, you've got to give the reader a chance to go, oh, thank God that's over. Or, that ended exactly how I thought it would. But sometimes, you got to make them think, that didn't end anything like I thought it would. Or, well, that ended, but it didn't end. You see what I'm getting at? And I know that the application of it can be really tricky. But once you understand it, and to understand it, you might have to actually Google non-harmonic tones and not just understand them in theory, but be able to hear them in music. Because we always, as writers, we are always trying to apply music to our writings through rhythm and cadence and melody. And we do that because otherwise our writing becomes flat. And no one wants to read flat writing, right? So read about non-harmonic tones and then find them in the music. And classical music is really good for non-harmonic tones. Of course it is. But there's plenty of... You're not going to find a lot of non-harmonic tones in the pretty standard pop music, because pop music is fairly formulaic to the point where there's not a lot of complicated music going on. There's not a whole lot of depth going on. You'll find a lot of non-harmonic tones in prog rock and prog metal. There's some great examples of non-harmonic tones in Devin Townsend's song Kingdom. You listen to the Devin Townsend Project version of it, with Anneke van Giersbergen in the background singing these melodies that she'll sing. She's not singing words at times, she's singing just and you'll notice that the music has resolved while she's still singing the same tone, and it adds this tension to it, and then it resolves finally. You're like, But adding that layer of tension where there might not otherwise be tension is important, because it adds depth. And depth is everything to us. Because writing without depth is shallow. And no one wants to read shallow writing. I don't think. I don't want to read shallow writing. So there you go. All right. That's it. That's what I've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. I've been hinting at. I know that it might not, on the surface, it might not sound like much, but once you really get into the nuts and bolts of it, you start realizing how important something like this can be to your writing, because it adds so much to it. And sometimes even the littlest thing can make the biggest difference. So give it a try, look it up, listen to music, and pick out the non-harmonic tones, and then see how you can apply it to your writing. I promise you, when you start doing this, you will be thrilled at the results. And so are you readers. Right, Muse? Not very good at that. Plus, it's cheesy as hell. Anyway, Muse, thank you for listening to me as always. And I'll be back next week. I don't know what we're going to talk about next week. I'm not going to hint at what we're going to talk about because I don't know. Anyway, thank you again, Muse. You were waiting, you see? You see that? You were waiting, anticipating. You knew what I was going to say, but I didn't say it. And now I'm going to say it. You, Muse, are awesome.